And today's topic is retaining and engaging new customers, tensions, and opportunities. So we're excited to explore into it. And I'm going to start by giving you a little bit of quick background on this project and why we're doing this and where this information is coming from. And then we'll jump into the conversation. So let's go ahead to the next slide. Great. So this project comes out of a national initiative that convenes leaders from across a broad spectrum of local and regional food systems to help identify how COVID is impacting our work, from direct markets to state policy and everything in between, to identify and share innovations and adaptations that are happening on the ground through this national platform. And we have a host of 16, 17 partner organizations. This is a cooperative agreement with USDA AMS, led out of the University of Kentucky with myself and Tim Woods. We've got incredible partners from Colorado State, two of which are on the call today, and you'll hear from Becca later, Becca Jablonski, and a colleague at Penn State, and all of our amazing organizations. And we're featuring just a few of them in every webinar, but we learn with all of their stakeholder networks, with the hope of strengthening networks across local and regional food systems to foster collaboration and resilience moving forward. So that's where we get to our catchphrase, building better beyond. So given the COVID disruption or moment as it is, how do we take the innovations that are happening during this time and leverage them for a more resilient future? And a vital part of this project is thinking about how we engage and think about local and regional food systems as a whole. So the best and most wily and challenging part of local food is that it looks different everywhere, and there are so many different pieces to it. So can we help pull leaders and thinkers and stakeholders together to see what we share and weave a common platform together? Because the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So let's work together. And these webinars and also the project are our way of keeping one foot in the weeds in the day-to-day work of getting food to people, and one on the horizon of thinking how we build resilient, just, and sustainable food systems. So through this project, we have a number of outputs. We have an online resource hub created by our communities of practice. So some of the best jewels of their COVID response work you can find there across all of our different stakeholder groups. I encourage you to go and look, as well as a series of sector snapshots that we call impact assessments that give you the rundown for each of the different sectors within local food and how they're being impacted by COVID and moving forward. A series of short, digestible, juicy little innovation nuggets we're calling innovation briefs that share some of the top of mind real-time adaptations and novel approaches that are coming out of our stakeholder networks. And this public webinar series is one of our outputs. So our way of sharing our conversations with you, our broader local food community. And next slide, I think. So today's webinar asks the question, how can the local and regional food sector work to ensure that the new customers that are coming to our markets will stay interested, stay motivated, love that fresh, seasonal, gorgeous product that they're experiencing, and how do we continue to build community in a virtual space? So this topic comes out of a series of focus groups that we hosted with our communities of practice over the course of this summer and early fall. And I think we had 20 different focus groups with almost 200 participants. So while we have 3 participants here today, the issues that we address in our webinars touch on all of those sectors, and we identified those shared issues across the focus groups, across sectors. And today's webinar brings together a broad array of perspectives on how stakeholders are responding to the shift in consumer interest and demand following the onset of the pandemic. And while local stakeholders serving wholesale markets like restaurants and institutions saw a stark drop in demand, many others experienced an unprecedented surge, and maybe some of you had that experience, as community members sought out local and alternative sources for their food, maybe a little bit of panic buying, and maybe they were coming to local food for the first time. This year also, we experienced a collective reckoning with our nation's racial inequalities and structural racism, and conversations sparked in part over the summer by the Movement for Black Lives spurred our organizations and individuals to look for ways to support BIPOC businesses and organizations. And while well-meaning, we're still very much on a learning curve. And so how do we build meaningful, lasting relationships with BIPOC communities that foster their resilience, self-determination, and well-being? It's a lot to cover, and we're lucky to have 3 fantastic panelists with a diverse array of experiences and perspectives to share with us. that's what we're talking about. And I'm going to turn it over to Becca to introduce those panelists.
Well, hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today. And thanks in advance to our three fantastic speakers that we have. So Josie Walker wears many hats. The ones we're going to highlight today is that she works for, she works with North Carolina Community Garden Partners as an advisory board member. And she's also a local food and food justice advocate and does much more than that you're going to hear about today. Some fantastic work connecting with some Black farmers and also with some Black churches. So it's going to be fantastic to hear from her. Stephanie Maynard also wears lots of hats. In fact, that's one of the reasons we chose the three panelists for today. She is the former board chair for NAFTMA, which is the International Agritourism Association, and the current board treasurer. She's also the owner operator of La Ferme Quinn, which is located outside of Montreal in Quebec. And then finally, we have Josh Stoll. Josh is an assistant research professor of marine policy at the University of Maine. And he also is actually an oyster farmer. And we're going to hear about some of that experience. And then he coordinates the Local Catch Network, which is a really fantastic organization and one of our communities of practice for this project. And with that, we're going to turn it over to the welcome Zoom poll here. And so I think Dawn is going to set that up for us. And what we want to have you answer is, how do you see food purchasing behavior changing during the next 3 to 6 months? And if you can check all that apply. So Lillian, I'm going to let you read these responses if you can see them.
I cannot.
We have about, I can do it. We have about 58% right in, but people are quickly putting them in. So let me get up to at least 75%. Okay.
Excellent. Yes. Of course, this is a really important question, something we're hearing a lot from the people we work with. They're trying to figure out what types of investments to make and if some of the ways that people have pivoted to making their purchasing and the type of food that they're purchasing is actually going to be continuing in a post-COVID world. Of course, who knows if the 3 to 6 months represent a post-COVID world, which is another question.
I think I put the results for everybody to see, but obviously for highlights, and it's going to add to over 100% because people could select all that apply. But everybody agrees we're going to continue to see the shift we've seen to online ordering and delivery persist. Some concerns about more restrictive opening hours and capacity for restaurants, increased use of food security options, which we're already seeing. And then also some who believe we'll see increased spending on local artisan and food direct from producers and in markets that are smaller or feel more secure. So lots of mixed opinions out there, but that mimics a lot of what we're seeing in the news for sure. So thanks, everybody.
Fantastic. Well, let's explore some of those things. That's very topical, and you'll see not only in today's webinar, but in later webinars in our series, we dive specifically into that online platform question and how local and regional food systems have pivoted. But let's get into the conversation with our colleagues here. Hi, Josie, say hello. Hi, Josh, say hello. And Stephanie, just say hello so we can see your faces and hear your voices.
Hello.
Hello.
Everyone.
Josh, let's start with you. So we've heard a little bit, but for those of us who aren't blessed to live on the coast, we don't always think of local seafood and local aquacultural products. What was the local seafood market like pre-COVID, and how did the consumer change affect your sector?
Yeah, thanks so much, Lane. That's a great question, and it's really a pleasure to be part of this webinar today. It's great to see so many people connected. The local seafood scene has been around for a long time, but unlike the ag sector, it's relatively immature. I remember, I think it was maybe 2010 when Bon Appetit magazine listed community-supported fisheries, the equivalent to community-supported agriculture, as the hottest food trend in the US. And so, we've had CSAs for a really long time, and CSFs are, they're 10 years old now. So in some ways, we've been having local seafood as part of the local food landscape for a little while, but it's relatively immature. When COVID happened, and I think we can think about it as early COVID and sort of later COVID now.
Yeah.
When it first happened, I would say it was marked by a lot of uncertainty, a time of loss. So we had a lot of fishing seasons that were delayed, prices crashed, dealers stopped buying seafood. But we also had this time of extraordinary innovation and creativity within the seafood sector, and a lot of emphasis around local and direct seafood marketing. To me, I think that was most characterized by what I've been calling this sort of digital duct tape.
I love it.
Yeah, there weren't really systems in place to get product direct to consumers, but we mobilized online platforms, Facebook pages, Facebook message boards, a lot of social media ads. Everyone and their uncle created these websites and maps to say, in our community, in our state, in the country, here's where seafood is available, here's how we find it. And so we were doing all this sort of rapid mobilization of digital infrastructure to help people connect. And with that, we also saw an extraordinary push towards local and regional distribution. There was a study done by researchers at Rutgers University. It was of something like 250 fishermen in New England. Something like 60 or 61% of those people who were surveyed reported shifting towards local and regional sales. That's pretty extraordinary. So we see this sort of pivot towards local when these national and international markets were really stuck. As you mentioned in the introduction, I'm part of something called the Local Catch Network. It's a network of communities engaged in local and direct marketing of seafood. We have a website that helps consumers connect to fishermen who are doing local and direct marketing of seafood. And we saw an extraordinary spike in web traffic. It was something like 300% increase in March and April. We also did some work with community supported fisheries across the US and Canada and looking at their web traffic. And we saw in all cases this extraordinary spike in the amount of people visiting their websites. And sort of anecdotally, we also have heard from most people in our network that they saw this incredible increase in demand. So there's really this sort of coming of age of local and direct seafood marketing. As you shift into that late COVID time where we are right now, I think there's this normalization happening. We're sort of going back to pre-COVID conditions where people are, I think quite frankly, fatigued, right? They're sick of cooking at home. They're wanting to get out of their own space. And so we're starting to hear reports of sort of the system kind of going back to normal. And I'd be happy to talk more about that, but I think I'll stop right there.
Perfect. Well, let's transition over to Stephanie. You run UPIC and some agritourism activities in a farm shop. And I was thinking in preparing for this call, you have a line on the outside, and the outside has never been more popular than it is during COVID. So what's how has COVID played out in the agritourism world, both in your operation and in your role looking at that sector more broadly?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right. The outdoors has become a very popular place. I think so many other places have been shut down. All the large festivals have been closed. So getting to a space outside has been very popular. And I think really important for people's mental health. We realized early on in March that as all the craziness was starting to hit, that we were going and taking walks on our farm just to take a breath of fresh air and to clear our heads. And it quickly occurred to us that many other people could probably benefit from that same kind of experience. And sure enough, we decided to open up our farm because a lot of agritourism farms, and particularly in the northern part of North America, don't have a whole lot going on March, April, May. Most of us are closed because it's cold and snowy. And So we decided to open our farm and just, for free, let people walk around. And the response was overwhelming because people just wanted the ability to meet up with their grandchildren and go for a walk and still socially distance in a safe outdoor space. And then I think that combined with the fact of trying to have access to local food became a huge wave. We were just returning from the UK, where farm shops are very popular and a big part of agritourism over there, whereas here in North America, it's a little bit more entertainment and very much you pick. And so we'd sort of decided, I think like many businesses that survived through the early days of COVID, was we adapted very quickly. And so we shifted our retail space into very much of a grocery store. So it had the benefit of being an essential service, which allowed us to stay open when other businesses were being shut down. And then just opening up the farm for people to walk really coupled well in that they could come out and get all of their groceries in a safe, that was not overcrowded, right? I think that when one of the poll questions of those smaller locations that have fewer people, it makes people feel safer. And that was a huge part of people coming out. And so having that outdoor space, that fresh air, and then having a safe place to do their groceries, which was one of the essential things that they wanted to do early on.
That's fantastic. I mean, I love the image of people wandering the fields with their grandchildren. And I have a lot more questions to follow up on what it was like having people their first time on the farm, out on the farm, and maybe if you had some fun or surprising experiences with that. But let's hear from Josie quick, since we're into the webinar. Josie, so along with the COVID pandemic, our country is also confronting a second and longer lasting illness and acknowledging legacies of racial injustice. And with that has come this well-intentioned, maybe over-enthusiastic interest in partnering with Black, Indigenous, and farmers of color. What's your experience been like working in that community? And how are you navigating it? Where has the surge come from, and what has it been like?
Well, it's like you said, it's well-intentioned, and it has been, well, it's waned, I think, somewhat. And for some people, it's gotten more intense. So the whole, I'm not even sure how to phrase it, but just, now that the struggles of farmers of color, Black farmers, Indigenous farmers has come to light, and more, not that people didn't know about it before, but it's more in your face. It's become more, well, we have to do something, which is great. And so people are trying to patronize more farmers of color. And one of the issues, I guess, that came across was, it's like, we want to support Black farmers. It was like, yeah, that's awesome. And then, okay, but we want, 600 dozen eggs. You can't do that. Like, even if they weren't farmers of color, that's just ridiculous. But just, getting people to realize that, just because you want something doesn't mean you can have it, you can't have it right then. And that how does local food work? I mean, that's another thing that we've had to deal with. How do you make, like Stephanie was saying, how in Europe it's more of a part of the culture that you go to a farm stand or you shop at the farmer's market, and here it's more entertainment. Like, how do we create that within the US and Canada?
Yeah. So what sort of organizations were reaching out to you to make these connections?
At the time, I was working with the Black Church Food Security Network. So there were Black churches in and around Baltimore that were transitioning away from where they were buying food to, we have a food budget. We want to support our Black farmers. And so they wanted to start, shifting away from processed food, from shelf-stable food, to fresh produce for their congregation.
And the expectations were a bit unrealistic. What did you find? What did they think they could get out of season? That I remember you sharing an anecdote about this, where you're just having to teach folks, and maybe this applies to everyone here, that seasonal food is seasonal.
Yeah. So one of the projects that we started was the Black Church Supported Agriculture. So got a true group of churches together to buy from Black farmers as a group. And and it's the season. When we started, it was the end of the warm season, the beginning of the cool season. So there was like the end of the tomatoes and not quite time for, like collards and kale and sweet potatoes. And the selection was kind of poor because of the time of year it was. And just trying to get the leadership to understand from the church and from our side that, this, we can only take what's there. We can't ask for, broccoli in August. I mean, you can, not locally, especially not coming from Virginia.
Right. And to come in last minute and say, we want it now. It's like, well, it's a 90-day crop. So we need a little bit of that notice.
Yeah. And trying to get people to understand that there's you have to plan for these things. So if the plan has been put in place, then you can only buy what the farmer planned for last season.
Yeah. Yeah. And that really speaks to the need to develop these relationships. I'm noticing that our hosts have put us in a featured spotlight. So now it's all as panelists like the Brady Bunch, which is fantastic. Stephanie, let's come back to you. So you've had some people probably experiencing farm life for the first time. What kinds of new programs did you have to put in place to manage this surge in interest in wandering the farm? And did you have any unexpected experiences?
Yeah, I mean, I think people walking about on the farm were mainly some of our regular customers who were just enjoying the extended season because we opened up much earlier than we normally would have given everything that was happening. But some of the main things we had to do is we just, U-pick farms can be very busy and crowded places in season, right? If you go to an apple orchard, there's quite a few people visiting all at one time on weekends at peak hours. So I think many of the agritourism farms implemented some reservation systems so that people had to reserve ahead of time, just so that we could limit the number of people on the site, that we could spread out the crowds and just have a little bit of control over, being a little bit worried about, allowing people to socially distance if they're getting on a wagon ride to go out to the field, or trying to avoid lineups at ticket booths or some of those spots, even coming in the farm shop, right, having to limit the number of people inside. Everybody, of course, having different rules throughout the two countries, states and provinces. And then we also started an online store, and I found it interesting, the poll earlier for the interest in online shopping. And following some of the statistics in North America, that sort of online purchasing of food has really skyrocketed. And yet, we saw a surge in that in the early days. And I like the idea from Josh before of sort of the beginning of COVID and the later end of COVID, because there definitely is a difference as people have sort of become accustomed to it. So early on, we definitely saw, tons of, you have 30, 40, 50 orders coming in every day in our online store. And that has really dwindled. And ever since, I would say, June or July, as people are a little bit more comfortable going back to their regular shopping location or coming in person, that's, 1 or 2 or 3 people a day. We're really curious to see how that continues on, right? As there's sort of a second wave hitting here in our part of the country, whether that's going to come back, whether in the winter months people don't want to go from place to place and they'd like to order online. But definitely we saw that people were still interested in a one-stop shop. I mean, there's a reason places like Walmart have done so well, because you can get everything in one location. So, we definitely found that by expanding our offerings and bringing in a lot of products, local seafood, local meats, all of their baking supplies, in addition to the things that we grow, really meant that we started to have a regular following of customers who were coming to buy their groceries, because there was still an interest to not have to. And I think COVID even more so, you don't want to go to 7 different places in your week. You want to try to limit your exposure and really go to one place. And so being able to provide that location for them to support local people in one place, I think was hugely to our advantage. Whether it's COVID or not COVID. I mean, once COVID goes away, we go back to the regular, the kids have soccer practice and gymnastic practice and we're busy again. And so we still are interested in that one-stop shop because it just makes our life easier. So, I think that for us was a huge eye-opening moment of being able to provide more diversified offering to our customer base so that they could really get everything they needed for the week in one place.
That's a great strategy. So yeah, expanding to products you hadn't carried before. I love the ticketing idea. If I could be sure I wouldn't have to be crowded in the Jump Castle. If I could reserve the Jump Castle alone, I don't know if you have one. You should get one. It'd be great. Josh, how does what you're hearing from sort of specialty crop and produce sectors, how does that resonate or parallel or diverge from what happened in your sector?
Yeah, I want to pick up on a couple quick threads that I've heard so far that strike me as relevant and interesting. Stephanie, you mentioned mental health and people heading to the farms just to be outside and to have space. You know, it's interesting. Mental health has been an important conversation in our network as well, and it actually is about the local distribution of seafood, and people are finding that direct connection with fishermen are finding that direct connection with their consumers is really important. Sort of what somebody has recently described as psychological nourishment, and we've heard this repeatedly from fishermen in our network saying it has been so valuable to us just to like get to see and get to connect with our neighbors and our communities, and I think that's something that's really interesting around sort of parallel. The other piece that I wanted to pick up on is online sales. I think for many people on our network, they have had online seafood platforms where they can sell, and it has been something they've had, but hasn't been a very big component of their businesses. And it seems like this is becoming a significant share of their sales. And I agree with you, Stephanie. I think time will tell if this becomes a habit that people glue onto, or it was sort of a fleeting moment in time saying we did that, good, now we're back to normal. And I quite honestly don't know, but it reminds me of some of the early conversations with CSFs when they were starting. Many of them were seasonal. So this is going to be a 12-month season or a 12-week season. You're going to get a delivery of seafood each week and for 12 weeks or 10 weeks or whatever it was. Some of the CSFs have switched to these auto renewal, and I'm sure the ag sector has done this as well. And there seems to be some success in that. It just sort of built in sort of habit. You don't have to like go through that process of renewal. And I sort of wonder how that will play out in this space as well. The one other thing that I would mention about sort of some of the effective strategies that we have seen, there has been some really innovative things in the aquaculture space here in Maine, where farmers are direct marketing their oysters and shellfish through basically the equivalent of U-Picks, where they set up a crate of oysters on their dock and they let tourists come down and pick shellfish or pick up seafood. And that has been a really interesting sort of model that we've poached from the ag sector to say, hey, that's working over in the agricultural space. Could we apply this to fisheries? And that has been, we'll see how it plays out long term, but it seems like there's some promise there.
That's so interesting. Speaking of good models, Josie, how are, I'm curious, I love this idea that Josh offered of psychological nourishment and how communities connecting between producers and consumers, but also maybe producers connecting with each other. So how are farmers of color working together to leverage this interest in supporting Black-owned farms and supporting Black food producers or within their own communities? What are some of the examples you're seeing?
Well, there's one tall grass food box that is in the Piedmont of North Carolina. They've gotten together a bunch of Black farmers to create a CSA. It's every other week, I think. And it started out because the people who created tall grass decided that, you know, our farmers aren't going to get any help, so we have to help them. So they got the farmers together, and they've been doing it pretty much since the beginning of the lockdown. And originally they wanted to, they were hoping to get 35 subscriptions, and now they're over 200, like
wow,
pushing 3. And they pay their farmers retail to make sure that they get paid for the work that they do. And as they've gone on, they've included more and more Black farmers who do different things with mushrooms, with meat, with different condiments and value-added products. So, and that, I mean, that's just one model that I know of. And also with, like I said, with the Black Church Food Security Network, they started the BCSA to bring business to Black farmers. And so, yeah, sorry.
That makes a lot of sense. So I love this idea that, like, mutual aid and helping each other, playing off, it's sort of flipping the idea of a one-stop shop on its head, where it's like one farm doesn't have to provide everything. If we're working from different sort of resource bases or interests and passions, like, we can band together and have many offerings in and amongst ourselves, instead of trying to do it all. That's a brilliant idea. Do you know where are those shares? Are they, who are their shareholders? Do you have a sense?
I also wanted to mention the Black Farmers Market. They have it once a month in Durham and in Raleigh.
Oh, cool.
Yes, and those farmers come from all over. But with Tallgrass, the shares are mostly in the Piedmont area, so Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill, like that section.
That's wonderful. And I had a great opportunity to speak with the founders of that, and they're an amazing group. And I encourage you all. And I see that Charlotte, our colleague from NC-SEPS, put a link, so please check them out in the bio. Okay, where was I? So Stephanie, you have we heard about your farm store. We heard about your U-Pick. How many different vegetables do you have? You've got a lot going on. Have you developed any new partnerships, or do you have any new allies in this work that have been helpful during the surge?
Yeah, so I mean, we grow fruits and vegetables, but one of the things that happened throughout all of North America when COVID hit was a huge hit to the meat processing sector. Just the types of people that tend to be employed in those sort of assembly line meat processing plants meant either because of their socioeconomic background or because of the close quarters in which they work, and the ventilation systems meant that COVID spread very quickly in a lot of those processing plants. And I know that happened here as well as throughout the US. And so access to meat and to a good fresh quality supply of meat kind of took a hit, and not just early on. I know here it's happened repeatedly. So there became a huge demand for meat, and we didn't have any connections. So connecting with some beef, pork, and chicken farmers to be able to be a location for them to sell that, because then some of the farmers markets weren't operating the way they normally did, or some of the places if they were selling to restaurants and the restaurants were closed, and so they didn't have necessarily access to how they were selling previous to that. But then also because the demand was coming from consumers, because access to meat was sort of becoming difficult. So that was a great opportunity for us to jump on board and make those connections, but also has made us worry about food security in all of North America when it comes to sort of our meat processing throughout the two countries, because they are very closely linked as animals go back and cross across the border. And then our other big partnership, we've always partnered with local food banks. When we have excess of vegetables, we send it their way. But there was obviously a much larger need in the last year in the food banks, with so many people unemployed and hurting. So we did everything that we could in terms of, it's a big part of our mission statement in our business is to support our community. So we did a lot of fundraisers whenever we could, or we did a trick-or-treating activity at Halloween, because trick-or-treating was another one of those touchy issues. We wanted to provide a safe place for people to come trick-or-treating, but we collected all of that money and donated it to our local food bank, because that's just one of those areas that as much as people are coming out to us, and I think one of those concerns I have in terms of an impact, all of this online shopping, online reservations, and online stores is great for those that can, but one of the issues we've run into is that people of a certain socioeconomic background may not have access to credit cards, right? A lot of this online shopping specifically requires credit cards in order to complete it, or even cultural groups. We have a lot of Orthodox Jews that visit us at some of the Jewish holidays, and they did not have access to credit cards to be able to do that online booking. So it does alienate a certain part of the population as we move more to that online shopping and reservation system that we'd never thought of before, because it wasn't how we had operated.
That's such a great point. Yeah, Josie.
Not only just socioeconomic, but location, like rural areas. I live out in a rural area. Like, even if I have a credit card, but I couldn't order anything because I don't think anybody would bring it to me. So no, I'm not even kidding. Like, I don't even think it's an option. So that's another, so being able to order your groceries online is great. But if you don't live either in or near a city of any size, then you're going to have to travel. You're going to have, or until we figure out the whole the local food thing on a very local small level, like, we're going to have to travel. So if there are agritourism or farms that have farm stands that have online platforms, like, will they deliver to rural areas? Will they make it so that if we do travel to buy local food, I'm not in a crowd, I'm not compromised in some way.
Yeah, that's a great point. My parents are in a very rural area, and I was like, I've never felt the desire for ClickList more than when COVID hit. I'm like, keep them safe. And also, we can think about SNAP benefits, right? We have a very limited offering for use of the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program online, but not so much. And so these questions I really appreciate us raising that question of access and who can benefit from these pivots and who might be left in the cold, and the importance of keeping a diversity of channels for equity and access as well. Josh, I keep bouncing from Stephanie to you because I'm over here like, oh, there's such interesting parallels. What are you hearing similarly around these questions of processing and infrastructure and how? Yeah, I'll just let you take it from there.
Yeah, I think this question of well, first of all, when it comes to processing, we certainly heard a lot about meat processing as a source of COVID outbreaks. We have having very similar sort of parallel outbreaks in the seafood processing sector. They're similar in many ways. And so that has been a big issue. When it comes to infrastructure, infrastructure is a really sort of chronic issue in fisheries, especially for small scale operators. We did a study last year where we asked people across the US engaged in fisheries about drivers of change, and climate change was number one. Loss of social capital was number two, and number three was loss of infrastructure. Those things are, of course, tightly interconnected, but we're seeing the loss of working waterfronts. We're seeing, and with that loss, we're seeing the loss of public access, hoists, cold storage, all these things that are really critical to local and regional distribution. So that's kind of the backdrop. And then you have COVID happen and people are scrambling to relocalize. And I think that has been this really interesting discussion point that we've had in the Local Catch Network about, wow, there's this enthusiasm for local food systems. There's this real interest in it. Well, what kind of infrastructure do we need in place to support that long term? We know that shocks are happening more frequently in food systems, and in particular in fisheries. Like, what would it take to support local and regional food systems? And one of the ways that seems to be playing out is, and this kind of goes to a point that Josie raised, is around groups of people getting together and working collaboratively and cooperatively. We're seeing this renaissance of fishing associations and fishing co-ops that are getting together to invest in working waterfront, to invest in infrastructure that they need, in joint processing facilities and things like that. And so that is kind of happening outside of the COVID space, but has been accelerated a little bit because of it. So I think that is a bright spot, but it is a need. It is a major obstacle for vibrant local and regional seafood systems.
That's so interesting. Yeah, I'm wondering, have there been, I'm also just kind of want to repost the question you, Josh, about new partnerships. So with working waterfronts, have you had to negotiate with local authorities, or how? There's just so many questions that I don't know about the world of seafood and fisheries and waterfronts. Any learnings there?
Yeah, so I think one of the really interesting pieces of this equation is that there has been, for good reason and important reason, this increased focus on food safety and for the consumer side. And seafood is a highly perishable product. And so we should be thinking about consumer safety. But the way those regulations have been developed and implemented, it really hasn't been with attention to how do we simultaneously support local and regional food systems. And so they create these mechanisms of consolidation and that I would say preferentially benefit larger scale operations, which are not necessarily focused on local and regional distribution. During the pandemic, we've seen, and even before that, we've seen this sort of pushback on that to say, okay, we recognize we want to keep consumers safe. Like obviously that is core to what we're doing, but how can we do it in a way that the costs aren't prohibitive to small scale operators, that the infrastructure needs aren't so big that it precludes small local distribution. And one of the outcomes of that is we're starting to see these fishermen markets, the equivalent of farmers markets, pop up, particularly on the West Coast. And they're working on saying, well, actually, what at docks where we have fishermen coming to offload product, can't we set up these fishermen's markets? And what are the regulatory changes that we need in place? And so one of those that has been stood up in the last couple of months is in Bellingham. And they had something like, I'm not sure the exact number, but thousands of people show up during the pandemic over the summer to support the industry around local distribution of seafood. It's never been something they've had, but COVID has really pushed people to say, we actually need this. And so it's forcing communities at the regional and the state level to rethink some of these food safety regulations and things like that.
Yeah, I was thinking if a food hub came to me and said, hey, we're thinking of bringing in seafood, I would be like, oh gosh, what does that mean for HACCP? What does that mean for like your FSMA compliance? Does that put you, you make such great points, Josh. I'm going to go to Stephanie and then I think we'll wrap up this section with Josie. But Stephanie, so Josh is talking about his vision moving forward for how COVID is sort of maybe jumpstarting conversations that were nascent and that they've gained more steam through this attention. What are you hoping will carry forward for your sector from the COVID bubble?
Yeah, I'm really looking forward, both within our industry and I think within the population in general, in terms of the quality of life. I'm very curious on, a lot of people have started working from home. Some people have maybe chosen to leave the workplace because, children are schooling at home and they need to, be paying attention to them. And so I'm really curious to see how much of a shift there's going to be from, there was just previously such this rush from one activity to the next and everything overscheduled to all of a sudden we're spending a lot more quality time at home, and whether that's going to continue. And we know that the rush on things like flour and sugar happened early on as people were doing more baking in their homes and cooking a lot of their own food, which I think is why we're seeing this rise on food purchasing from grocery stores. Unfortunately, to the detriment of maybe the restaurant industry. But certainly this question of quality of life, and it's influenced us in our business with having these online reservations and forcing us to reduce the number of people, right? Because a lot of the regulations said we had to have fewer people on the site for social distancing, actually made it so much more enjoyable. It was a much more enjoyable experience for our customer. It was more enjoyable for our staff. And then because our store sales have just, gone up 50% this year. We were much busier, much earlier on. We decided to close our business for a day of the week, which we'd never done previously, just to give our staff a day off. Well, we love it, right? We have enough energy to get through the season. We're not burnt out the way we'd normally do after a rush of the season. So I think, in our business, we're having a lot of conversations of what all of those things we stopped doing, like birthday parties and school groups and all the extra, what do we want to bring back once this is all done? Because we actually really enjoyed having a reasonable work day and not having to work 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, but actually having something a little bit more bearable. And then just a lot of curiosity on what the general public is going to do once this is all done. If, I think there's a large portion of them that are going to say we kind of preferred this way of life. And so is some of this going out of your way to support local and buying food to make food in the home, how much of that is going to continue on long term as they realize that we don't need this rush from one thing to the next in our lives.
That's gorgeous. And I love how centered mental health and sort of personal well-being has been. I'll share an anecdote from a farmer here that was a wholesale specialty crop grower that had to pivot to direct to consumer. They had a CSA before, didn't like it. It was that same sort of burnout thing and dealing with the customers. And now they just basically have an online grocery or online produce retail. They sell people only what they want. They deliver it 2 days a week. And he said he may never go back because of the quality of life for him. He's like, if I don't want to work this weekend, I don't put anything in the store and I get to like take a day off. What a novel concept. So I'm really heartened that people are taking the well-being, their mental health and their family's well-being and I love that question of what do we carry forward? What do we want to bring back? What can we edit out that makes this more sustainable? Okay, Josie. So we're going to do this last question, then we'll open it up to general Q&A. I'm sure people are chomping at the bit. But so it sounds like your community is experiencing the surge of well-intentioned people who may or may not have connections with Black communities or communities of color and farmers of color. And maybe they're unsure how to move forward, how to set up relationships. Are there some practical recommendations or some good guidelines? If someone's like, I'm feeling awkward, I know I need to do better, or I know I need to do things differently. What would your guidelines, what would your advice be?
Well, first, if you feel like that's something you should be doing, do it. Like don't try to make it into anything more than I'm going to purchase from this person, period. Like why you're doing it is, I mean, it's important to you, but to make it a big deal to the farmer, it's just not right. Because you're making it like I'm buying from you because you're Black. It's like, okay, that's fine, but like, are you?
I also have great product.
Yeah, it's like, it's like I hope you enjoy my vegetables as well. And are you going to do it next week too? Like, one, make it consistent so it doesn't feel like, oh, I'm just buying from you so I can show everybody, look, there's a Black or brown person that sold me a tomato. And also don't just like the churches, like don't go to the farmer or the fisherman or whoever in the hopes that I want what I want because I'm used to XYZ. I want you to give it to me. I want to get it, but I want you to be the one to sell it to me. And that's not always the case because either that's not my specialty or I sell a different variety or I'm just not big enough to give you everything. Just manage your expectations, and just come back. At the end of the day, that's the biggest thing because a lot of people did start buying from farmers of color, from Black farmers, from indigenous farmers, and they stopped because I guess everybody stopped looking, and that's not going to get anybody anywhere.
I love that. Yeah. Show up and keep showing up, which is maybe a through line for all of us who are working in this local food movement. How do we keep them showing up? So we've got 11 minutes left. There's a million more questions I want to ask, but I also want to invite Becca, who I think is watching our chat, to see if there's any questions. And I would invite anyone who's listening to put your questions in the chat and we'll ask some of the panelists. And while we're waiting for those to come in, I will open it up totally and say, I'm really interested in this question of the authentic farm experience, or like if local food systems have historically been built on knowing your farmer, building relationships, having a sense of community, and yet here we are on Zoom for a year. Are you seeing any great ways that people are fostering that sense of connection, or what creative ways can we think through to build those relationships?
I think part of why we've seen a rise of people going and supporting local is partly because we are so socially distanced. We're so isolated in our homes that they're just looking for any kind of connection. And it's one of the few places that are open and available and accessible for them to have some kind of connection. And I find we're having far more conversations with our customers than previously, where they would come in and they grab their pie and they would leave. They want to know what's going on. They want to know how we're doing. They want to know how we're growing things. But I think partly just out of a need to connect with somebody because we're so isolated currently.
Yeah.
I would just build off of that, and I think I can respond to this question here about what are each of us doing to keep sort of future COVID customers. I think this conversation today is about COVID and the food system, but let's not forget that we have this history of shocks in our food system. The economic crisis of 2007, 8, 9, whatever that was a pretty good example of that in fisheries. September 11th, in a weird way, was also one of those in some fisheries in the US. So we have this like history, and I think we can learn a lot from that history and apply it to today, and maybe apply it to the future as well. And I think one of the lessons that I have learned in trying to dig back into this history is that each time we have one of these crises, one, we forget about the past ones, but two, we have this like weird sort of public pivot back to local and back to community as like, it's like our comfort blanket. And some part of me wishes that there was this transformation, and then part of me thinks, well, actually, maybe this is just part of the cycle that happens. And how do we position ourselves to provide that service to society during these crises, and recognize that there will be a waning of interest during sort of normal periods. And you know, is that, maybe that's not good enough, but I think it's part of the equation. And I think we're starting to see that sort of waning back to normal right now in the pandemic. But I do think there's this interesting sort of history that's important.
Yeah, it's part of the work. So my work here at the University of Kentucky, but I'm not working on this project, is directing a center called the Food Connection. And part of that is our learning kitchen, and we have culinary programming, and we are used to doing hands-on, elbow to elbow, bumping into each other cooking classes where we introduce everyone from college freshmen to 4-H kids to fancy chefs to local seasonal product. And the COVID pivot for us was pivoting to virtual trainings and trying to, for people who may, through Farmers to Food Box programs, who may be getting fresh produce for the first time, or people who are in taking advantage of double dollars programs at the farmers market. And I'm sort of skimming this question here on the edge of how to reach, how to make those connections with folks who might feel like local food isn't for them. And we're just trying to make it as approachable and as accessible as possible. And plug in food where people play. Do you all have any other ideas on that? Or how are you connecting with people that feel like local food isn't for them? And I'm also thinking about, Josh, with seafood. Like if I barely learned how to cook salmon at home, it felt like a major accomplishment for me. I was very proud, but if you gave me an oyster or something in a shell, I would be hopeless. So is there a culinary component to this that we haven't touched on? And have you all seen it, or Stephanie, have you seen it in your world?
I mean, I do think there's a culinary piece to this, but I also, I mean, this idea of normalizing local foods, and it's just food is where we need to go. I was at a gas station sometime this summer, and right next to on the counter there was all these little Post-it notes that somebody had taped over, and with these little like messages. And one was like something about a deer permit that you could get if you were going deer hunting, and one was about ice, and the other one was about oysters. And like, when's the last time you went to a gas station and they had fresh local oysters? And to me, that's what it is. It's like, how do we get local food to just be food, and not the thing you do as special, but the thing you do. And we need seafood in every gas station, you know, like, to me, that's like the image that is part of it. And I think it, you know, yeah, it's not a full
chicken in every pot and an oyster with every gas pump. I love it.
Yeah, I don't know about getting oysters at the gas station, but you know, I'm from near the coast. We're not right on the water. But, you know, local fish is something I grew up with. Like, buying fish from the grocery store was foreign to me for years. So, you know, not having a fish market just doesn't make any sense. Like, I can't imagine not having one. But at the same time, you know, for people who didn't grow up that way, you know, how do you clean a fish? Do you do it yourself? Or, you know, if you have a fish market, you'll probably ask the person to clean it for you. You know, but you get it clean, but did you, how do you ask for it? Like, how do you tell them what you want done to it? Do you know what to do to it? To like cooking salmon. I've never cooked salmon. I don't particularly like salmon, but there are lots of local fish that people don't know, but everybody knows what salmon is. Everybody, most people know what flounder is. And, and there's a whole like host of things that people don't know about their local food system that, like Josh said, we should just make it like, this is fish, this is this thing, and we just eat it because it's here and not because, it's local, even though, local is better, but I don't know, how do you make it not like a special thing? And why does it cost more even though it's from down the road, which is another issue, but if you see the value in it, you don't mind. But, I guess for people who aren't used to eating local food or feel like it's not for them, I think part of it is like, if it's from down the road, like, why does it cost more? Why is it more of a hassle for me to get it? Which, I guess it's something that as a group, we have to figure out.
Yeah.
I think there's that disconnect to the culinary side. I mean, I agree when it comes to seafood, I feel like I could learn a whole lot before I'm ready to go and buy some oysters and cook them at home. But we're far from even that point. I mean, we've seen over the last 10 years that people call us in January to go apple picking. And I mean, I'm up in Canada, so we're under, 5 feet of snow. People went popcorn picking this year and they want to know if they can boil it like sweet corn. They want to pick pumpkins out of trees. The disconnect has become so huge. So they don't know how to cook it. If it doesn't come in a prepared meal and out of a restaurant, and I mean, restaurants are taking a hard hit, but the reality was, as North Americans, we were eating 2 out of 3 meals in a restaurant. So now that people are cooking at home, they don't know how to cook. They don't know how to buy local food and take that home and make something with it. And I mean, we're certainly over the next year going to look at, and as part of making that accessible, how do we somewhat prepare and package? Is it already cubed? Is it already chopped? Is it, come with all the ingredients where you just throw it in a pot and cook it? Because the reality is, while people are moving back to that in this COVID pandemic, they just don't know how to cook food. They don't know where their food comes from. They don't even know what questions to ask because they don't understand the product to begin with. You get into eggs and they want to ask you if they're free range or organic or grain fed, but they don't even know what questions to ask you because they don't know what any of those things mean. And I think that's where the conversation piece comes in, but the disconnect has become so huge that there's just a lot of education at a basic level that needs to happen, I think, before people feel comfortable going up to a farmer to buy food because they don't even know what they should be buying or what questions they should be asking.
Yeah. Thanks. So I'm going to invite Becca to pull up our closing slides here. There's some incredible questions in the chat that we can stick around or we can follow up on, but a number of those topics like how do we get food to more people who can access it? What's being done on the policy level around local foods? How the connections to emergency food are coming in our upcoming webinar. So join us December's not on here, but December will be local food in the emergency food system, which Stephanie mentioned and Josie mentioned. And I don't know if there's local seafood in the emergency food system, but I'm really compelled by this idea of if we have people feeling comfortable and confident they've eaten local food before, if it's coming to all of our community, then that's when seasonal fresh food becomes just food. And we heard a really powerful quote from one of our local stakeholders here in Lexington that said they were getting fresh product and in the emergency food, and they said, I finally feel like someone actually wants me to live, which just, hit me in the heart. So please join us in December, sign up for the rest of the series. We're out of time, but I would invite everyone to give a giant virtual high five or party to our amazing panelists. You'll receive follow-up information from us, a summary of this webinar, but you can also go to our website. Our local food resource hub will post the link and you can find it. You found this webinar, so I'm assuming you can find it. Recordings of the past and future webinars will be there, the resource hub, the innovation briefs, the impact assessments, all of those goodies, connections to our speakers today. Please give them your kudos. I am so grateful. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you, Josie. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Joshua. Thank you to Becca, Becca Javonsky, who was in the back, and all of my project partners. And I hope to see you all in December. So yay. Thank you.